The U.S. Grains Council is pleased to present the 2022-2023 edition of the Corn Harvest Quality Report. This is the 12th year of our harvest reports. The U.S. Grains Council has worked for more than 50 years to build partnerships based on trust with importers of U.S. corn as your bridge to the most reliable supply of corn in the world. To enhance the information we provide to export customers about the quality of U.S. corn supply, the U.S. Grains Council initiated a series of annual corn quality reports in 2011 that we developed in two parts. First, this harvest quality report that surveys U.S. corn quality at harvest as it enters the marketing system and was published in November. Then a follow-up report, which will be published in March, is the export cargo quality report, which looks at the quality of the corn crop as it is assembled for exports early in the marketing year. It is important to study both reports as quality at export is affected by the quality at harvest and by many factors in the U.S. grain marketing system. We have established processes for sample collection and testing, and as we follow these processes year after year, we are assembling an expanding database of transparent, objective information about U.S. corn quality. The results of this harvest quality report are based on 600 samples taken at the first point of commercial delivery of corn and collected from August 25th through November 17th, 2022. Samples were collected from 12 states that account for over 90% of U.S. corn exports. The results for these samples are provided for the U.S. aggregate and also are divided into three broad groups called export catchment areas, or ECAs, defined by the three major pathways for U.S. corn exports and illustrated in this map. The Harvest Quality Report includes quality test results for the following factors: U.S. grade factors, including test weight, broken corn, foreign material, total damage and heat damage, moisture, chemical composition, protein, starch, and oil, along with physical factors, and 6 mycotoxins. Weather plays a large role in corn planting process, growing conditions, and grain development in the field. These in turn impact final grain yield and quality. Overall, 2022 was characterized by a late planting season, mainly due to a cool and wet April. However, after April, the weather turned warmer for the remainder of the growing season. So you could characterize the rest of the growing season by scarce rains at pollination time, heat and drought during the grain filling period, and a quick dry down and harvest. Overall crop yield in 2022 averaged 172.3 bushels an acre, or 10.81 metric tons per hectare, which was a little bit lower than the 5-year average from 2017 to 2021 crops. In terms of the quality factors results in relation to the 5-year average, test weight was higher than the 5-year average in 2022. BCFM was higher, total damage was lower, moisture was similar, protein was higher, starch was lower, and oil was lower. Stress cracks were higher, along with 100 kernel weight, similar true density, and lower whole kernels. 98.3% of samples were less than or equal to the FDA action level for mycotoxin of 20 parts per billion. Only one sample tested above the FDA advisory level for DON of 5.0 parts per million, and 98.9% of samples were less than or equal to the FDA fumonisin guidance level of 5 parts per million. The first set of test results we will present are the grade factors and moisture. U.S. corn is traded on the basis of grades established by the U.S. government. In order to meet the requirements for a given grade of corn, a load of corn must achieve the minimum standards for all four factors of that grade. The key grading factors are shown in this chart. Average test weight in 2022 was 58.5 pounds per bushel. This is higher than the 5-year average of 58.2 pounds per bushel, and 93.1% of our samples met the grade factor requirements for US number 1 grade. You can see in the map at the upper right, test weight averages by export catchment area, or ECA. You can see that the Southern Rail ECA, with an average of 58.9 pounds per bushel, had the highest test weight of the 3 ECAs. Finally, you can see the average test weight results for each of the 12 historical harvest reports in the green bar chart at the bottom right. This slide presents the same information as the previous slide, but in metric units. You can see that the U.S. aggregate test weight was 75.3 kilograms per hectoliter in 2022. For broken corn and foreign material, or BCFM, U.S. aggregate was 0.9%, which is slightly higher than the 5-year average of 0.8%. About 92.2% of the harvest samples collected this year were at or below the U.S. number 1 limit of 2.0%, and 97.7% were at or below the limit for U.S. number 2 grade of 3%. BCFM in 2022 consisted mostly of broken corn, which is similar to previous years. Remember, our average BCFM at the U.S. aggregate level was 0.9%, while the average broken corn at the U.S. aggregate level was 0.7% of the 0.9%, which is slightly higher than the 5-year average broken corn of 0.6%. The foreign material portion of BCFM averaged 0.2% this year at the U.S. aggregate level. And you can see in the bottom right that FM has been generally consistent across the 12 years of this report. A chipped or slightly broken kernel is not BCFM if it does not pass through a 12/64 inch sieve. To understand the proportion of slightly broken or chipped corn, which are not in the broken corn portion of BCFM, the U.S. Grains Council conducts a test for percent whole kernels. This measures the percentage of BCFM free corn that are whole kernels by weight. This year's U.S. aggregate average percent of whole kernels was 91%, which was lower than 2021 of 92.3% and the 5YA of 91.7%. The final two grade factors are total damage and heat damage, which heat damage is a subset of total damage. This year's average total damage was 1.2%, which was higher than 2021 of 0.7%, but lower than the 5-year average of 1.5%. There was absolutely no heat damage in the 600 samples collected and tested in 2022. Moisture is not a grade factor, but it is important for buyers and often included in the terms of the sales contract. U.S. aggregate moisture in 2022 was 16.3%. This was similar to the 5-year average of 16.4%. The one thing I'll point out is that moisture information is collected by the participating elevators, and average moisture for each sample is written on the sample bag before it's submitted. Chemical composition of corn is important because the components of protein, starch, and oil are of significant interest to end users. However, the chemical composition attributes are not grade factors. Unlike many physical attributes, chemical composition values are not expected to change significantly during storage or transport. Protein is very important for poultry and livestock feeding because it supplies essential amino acids and helps to improve feed conversion efficiency. This year's U.S. aggregate protein was 8.8%, considerably higher than the 5-year average of 8.5%. You can see the Southern Rail and Pacific Northwest each had average protein of 9%, while the Gulf had an average protein of 8.6%. This year's higher protein values were most likely caused by the dry weather experienced generally across the Corn Belt. Starch is an important factor for corn used by wet millers and dry grind ethanol manufacturers. Starch is usually inversely correlated with protein, so the higher protein values this year likely caused starch to be slightly lower than the 5-year average. U.S. aggregate average starch in 2022 was 71.9% compared to a 5-year average of 72.3%. Oil is our final quality factor in the chemical composition section. Oil is an essential component of poultry and livestock rations. U.S. aggregate oil in 2022 averaged 3.9%, slightly lower than the 5-year average of 4.0%. Average oil was the same across the 3 export catchment areas. For these reports, we measure additional physical factors, quality attributes that are not grade factors or chemical factors. These factors provide additional information about the processability of corn for various uses, as well as its storability and potential for breakage in handling. Stress cracks are internal fissures in the hard or horniest endosperm of the corn kernel, often caused by high temperature drying due to unfavorable growing conditions. The presence of stress cracks indicates an increased susceptibility to breakage when the corn passes through the marketing chain. Higher levels of stress cracks may reduce starch yield in wet milling and may reduce flake size in dry milling. Average stress cracks at the U.S. aggregate level in 2022 was 6.9%, higher than the 5-year average of 5.9%. The next 3 quality factors tested are hunter kernel weight, measured in grams, kernel volume, measured in cubic centimeters, and kernel true density, measured in grams per cubic centimeter. Hunter kernel weight indicates kernel size, which affects drying rates and flaking grit yields in dry milling. Kernel volume indicates growing conditions or is indicative of growing conditions and genetics. And kernel true density reflects kernel hardness. U.S. aggregate hunter kernel weight was 33.94 grams in 2022. This average was lower than the 5-year average of 35.05 grams. The lower average this year likely was the result of the lower yields experienced in the 2022 crop compared to previous crops. U.S. aggregate average kernel volume was 0.27 cubic centimeters. This average was slightly lower than the 5-year average of 0.28 cubic centimeters. Kernel true density is a calculation which is calculated by dividing hunter kernel weight by kernel volume. U.S. aggregate kernel true density in 2022 was 1.253 grams per cubic centimeter. This was similar to the 5-year average of 1.256 grams per cubic centimeter. The U.S. aggregate average hard endosperm this year was 88%. This average was higher than the 5-year average of 81% and indicates a larger proportion of horniest endosperm in the kernels this year, likely an indication of kernel hardness as well. Mycotoxins are toxic compounds produced by fungi that occur naturally in grains. When consumed at elevated levels, mycotoxins may cause sickness in humans and animals. Aflatoxin, DON, and fumonisin are considered to be three of the most common mycotoxins found in corn. These three mycotoxins are tested in this year's report and have been tested in each of the previous 11 reports as well. I'll also add that the Council has tested corn samples for ochratoxin A, T2, and zearalenone in each of the last three harvest reports. A total of 180 of the 600 samples in this year's harvest report were evaluated for the 6 mycotoxins. The goal is to report the frequency of detection in the harvest samples more so than reporting an average level of or average concentration of an individual mycotoxin. This slide illustrates key levels of aflatoxin in parts per billion. Two levels to point out are the FIJS lower conformance limit of 5 parts per billion. This level was established by FIJS to indicate a detectable level of aflatoxin, and 20 parts per billion, which is the FDA action level for aflatoxin in corn. Samples with no detectable levels of aflatoxin were lower than 2021 and 2022. 86.1% of our samples contain less than 5 parts per billion of aflatoxin this year. 98.3% of samples tested below the FDA action level of 20 parts per billion. This slide displays the historical aflatoxin results for the 12 years of the Corn Harvest Quality Report. You can see that the drought year of 2012 had the highest frequency of samples with aflatoxin greater than 20 parts per billion of 11.9%. No other year has had over 2.1% of samples with greater than 20 parts per billion. The percent of samples below 1.5 parts per million was slightly lower than 21 and 2020 at 94.4% in 2022. Still, this represents a low frequency of contamination of DON or vomitoxin in this year's samples, indicating that the growing season was not conducive to DON or vomitoxin development. Fumonisin is the third mycotoxin evaluated in this year's Corn Harvest Quality Report. You can see that 98.9% of the 180 samples tested contain less than 5 parts per million of fumonisin this year, indicating weather conditions were not conducive to fumonisin development in 2022. The final 3 mycotoxins evaluated in this year's Harvest Quality Report are ochratoxin A, T2, and zearalenone. This is the third year of testing for each of these 3 mycotoxins, and I will point out that weather conditions were not conducive to the formation of any of these 3 mycotoxins. So ochratoxin A, 100% of our samples were less than 5 parts per billion. Moving on to T2, 100% of the samples evaluated in 2022 contained less than 1.5 parts per million of T2. Finally, 100% of the samples evaluated in 2022 contained less than 1.5 parts per million of zearalenone as well, indicating that weather conditions were not conducive to the development of this mycotoxin. The 2022 harvest samples were, on average, good, with 95.3% of samples grading number 2 or better, compared to 98% in 2021 and 94.5% in 2020. Test weight, VCFM, protein, and stress cracks were all higher than their 5-year averages, while total damage and kernel volume were lower than the 5-year averages, reflecting growing and harvesting conditions. The growing season was conducive to aflatoxin development in some areas, but we should see minimal issues with the remaining 5 mycotoxins given this year's growing season conditions. This concludes the presentation of the 2022 U.S. Grains Council Corn Harvest Quality Report. Thank you.